Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this webinar. Juste pour ceux qui parlent français, vous trouverez un canal en français sur le bas de l'écran. Well, my name is Kylie Giroux. I'm the Partnership Associate Director at the Global Cyber Alliance. We're proud to host today's webinar on the online safety of journalists in partnership with the E-Governance and Internet Governance Foundation for Africa, iLab Africa, the Liberia Cybercrime Prevention and Mitigation Agency, Riale Cybersecurity, and Serianu. For those who don't know the Global Cyber Alliance, we're a non-for-profit organization dedicated to reducing cyber risks for all, and especially those communities that are essential to the good functioning of our society, such as journalists. In October 2020, thanks to the support of our sponsor, Craig Newmark Philanthropy, we launched a cybersecurity toolkit for journalists to provide free and effective tools to help journalists protect themselves online. Journalists are the eyes and ears of every emerging event in the world. While their work has inherent risks, it is evident that in the last decade, a critical threat has emerged due to the increasing dependency on technology. The internet is now an integral part of journalism. While it brings great opportunities to distribute information at scale, today's digital-centric world has also opened new challenges to press freedom. Whether it's cyberbullying, intimidation, impersonation, threat of source exposure, or the revelation of personal information that can lead to real-world danger, the tactics are all meant to intimidate journalists and news organizations from pursuing inconvenient truth. For many journalists, a cyber incident can be devastating and lead to reputations damaged, misinformation distributed, or sensitive information compromised. Online vulnerability has also opened up possibilities for harassment, especially against journalists representing or being part of an underserved and marginalized demographic group, such as women. Our panelists today will share experiences on the risks faced by journalists on the ground, discuss the significant impact that cyber harassment and intimidation can have on freedom of expression, and address the current policy efforts in place to overcome these challenges. We believe it is an incredibly important topic, and we again thank our partners and each of the speakers for taking the time and energy to address this important challenge. Thank you. I now give the floor to the first moderator, Julian Haida, who will introduce the panelists.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Kaylee, and thank you all for joining us. We have a great panel that are going to talk about a very interesting and important topic. As Kaylee noted, speech these days is more just speech. It's more than just talking to someone else or passing a note. It is mediated by this thing we call the internet. And when it comes to free speech and the free press, that mediator in the middle can often make things a little bit more challenging. It brings people together like it does with us right now, but it can also make some things more challenging. Now, I'm excited we're talking today with 3 panelists who work across the African continent. The African continent, I think, doesn't get nearly as much attention as it should in places like Europe, where I'm right now, or the United States, where I come from. But because of that, I also think a lot of the insights and a lot of the challenges there can stand to teach us elsewhere in the world and in other countries in Africa how to meet these challenges and how to really build something important and sustainable despite the challenges. And truly, if I've ever met someone who knows a thing or two about human rights and free speech, chances are they've worked somewhere on the African continent, because the experiences there are just unbeatable. So without further ado, without me yapping out any longer, I'd like to introduce our panelists. They'll give a short presentation, and then we'll open up the floor for some discussion. First, with us is Mohammed Shanufi. He's the Education and Communities Regional Coordinator for the Digital Security Helpline at Access Now. Check out Access Now, it's really cool. Mohammed focuses on strengthening the impact of the helpline's preventative assistance in the Middle East and Africa. He works in North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. So he has those kind of insights and sustains relationships with intermediaries, help desks, trainers, and other regional partners while also contributing to efforts across the wider international community of practice. He'll present shortly, but first I want to introduce the rest of our panelists so you can have a sense of who to direct your questions to as you're hearing all of the presentations. Next is Bulanda Kowani. She is a program officer for Southern Africa at the Paradigm Initiative. She researches and writes on topics of technology, digital rights, internet governance, and digital inclusion. She's actively involved in internet policy forums and discussions at all levels and is a co-convener of the Zambia Internet Governance Forum. She graduated from the Africa School of Internet Governance. Thank you so much for joining us, Bulanda. And Palui Tomasi is with us as well. He is the International Federation of Journalists Africa Director at the IFJ. He is involved in the defense and the promotion of the rights of journalists in the continent, most especially in relation to freedom of expression and of the press, freedom of association, labor rights, and the right to organize. This is something that's very close to my heart as a journalist. I was also involved in some labor issues in the United States. Palui has experience in Lesotho, Malawi, Swaziland. The list goes on and on. Thank you so much for joining us as well, Palui. And without further ado, let's start it with these presentations. Mohammed, I understand you have some visuals to share with us, so please take it away. And also, as you're listening, feel free to add your questions. I'll be looking through them. The Q&A at the bottom of your chat screen. Go ahead, Mohammed.
Be in this panel and be able and given the opportunity to present our organization's work and know more about my co-panelists and also receive questions. So the presentation is an overview about what we do at the helpline, which is a facility that we created out of the idea to protect and extend digital rights of human rights defenders and users at risk. There is the French and the English version. So first of all, a quick word about, so in the next slide, you would find a quick presentation about our organization. It's an organization that saw the light and was born around 2008 out of the green revolution in Iran, and at that time it was probably the first time that a social media network helped folks organize online and go out to the streets to voice out their ideas and claim freedom. That's how Access Now idea came out. And since then, lots of folks joined the crew. And in the next slide, we can see more about multiple teams that forms our organization. So the policy team, the advocacy team, the legal team, the grants team, and RightsCom team. Of course, policy works on international policies. We work with the European Union, Parliament, as well as the decision makers in Washington, D.C., and also in Asia and Latin America. Those are the main spots of our policy team. Advocacy folks work on campaigns like the one I think is very widespread in the African countries, especially, that is Keep It On, that advocates for keeping internet always on, especially in conditions of protests and elections in the MENA region and the African continent in general. Internet interferences are a big deal whenever it comes to election and protests. Legal team works on legal issues in coordination with policy team. Grants team also gives the opportunity to maybe smaller NGOs to work on the same issues that are close to our heart. And RightsCon organizes that event we annually have once a year that regroups all the folks caring about digital rights. In the next slide, I will talk more about the team I am part of, which is the helpline. The helpline idea is to provide digital security assistance free for all human rights defenders who cannot afford to have technical support for their needs. And we've seen that the attacks that are happening offline are also happening online, whether it is harassment, hacking. We saw recently with NSO the amplitude and magnitude of attacks against human rights defenders by very resourceful enemies, I should say. So yeah, we are part of the defense team against all of that. And in the next slide, you may see how we are organized. So the main mantra we want to claim and say is that we are available 24/7, all the time, every day of the year, because attacks never wait, and danger is always there online. So we are one email away from any human rights defender who would verify and trust after the vetting process. We are only one email away or one message away to all freedom fighters to help on digital security attacks. We work from different spots. The main ones are San Jose in Costa Rica, Tunisia, and Manila. We follow the sun, that's our policy. So whenever Manila's shift is over, Tunis takes it on, and then whenever Tunis office shift is over, Costa Rica is on the lead. So we split the 24 hours on 3, so 8 hours, 8 hours, and 8 hours. That's the way we can be online all the time. We can reply in several languages: French, English, Spanish, Portuguese, Tagalog, etc. So yeah, in the maybe next slide, it shows how you can get in touch with us. So yeah, those are details about how we can even set up secure communication. We tend to prefer end-to-end encrypted communication whenever possible. So whether it is through PGP, but if the person is not familiar with that, we can use even Signal to reach out to us. And yeah, securing the communication is essential, but should not be an obstacle to provide help. So yeah, it's a threat risk assessment, threat modeling approach that we have. And of course, the most important thing is not to harm the help seeker and provide help at the same time. Yeah, in the next slide, I think there is a list of all the services that we provide, and it corresponds to also all the attacks that are faced by journalists, human rights defenders, and freedom fighters who are our beneficiaries. Threat modeling and risk assessment is more related to organizational digital security approach, where we try to do security assessments and identify the enhancement and implementation actions that can benefit, that an organization can benefit from to increase their level of security. Secure communication, I've already spoken about end-to-end encrypted communication. You might have heard of Signal, which is our fetish app and the one that we want to promote the most. But there are, of course, other communication tools. File storage security is an important thing, especially for organizations or journalists who are documenting human rights violations. So we can help on that as well. I won't extend on the rest to not monopolize the speech, but those are on the top 3 of the things we do. And you can check our 10,000 report on our website. I put the link there, but I can send it also on the chat, or if you send me an email, it kind of gave an overview about what we've done across these years. And of course, we do rapid response, which is normally something dedicated. The idea is inspired from the corporate field, where banks and governmental agencies have their teams that defend their digital assets, and we try to provide that to a nonprofit and human rights organization as well. That's it for me. Maybe in the next slide you can find my email and the email of our team. Whenever you reach out to them, they create a ticket, they give you an ID and can follow up with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mohammed, for that really interesting presentation. I looked into, and we'd kind of worked with Access Now before, but I had no idea how it all worked and how it all kind of came together. So that was really, really interesting, and it's very important work, and I think needed everywhere. So I just wanted to summarize very quickly before we move on to the next presentation. The Access Now has lots of different initiatives. The one that Mohammed spent most time talking about is the helpline. It's available 24 hours in multiple different languages that people can, who are struggling with intimidation or attacks. And this is something that really stood out that I've repeated a lot in the past as well. Attacks that happen offline are now happening online. So it's a bit of a scary prospect. People think of the internet as being this virtual place, a place that isn't really real. But of course, it's very real when what you're doing is using it to challenge very powerful institutions and people. The Access Now does a lot of threat modeling for journalism and for free speech and activists. Born out of the insight of a lot of social movements. They want to keep the internet on in times of elections and protests, and they have lots of tools available, storage, communication, documentation for human rights purposes, etc. I hope that was an adequate summary. It was so interesting. Please do follow up with Mohammed via email to learn more. Next, I would like to invite Bulanda onto the floor to speak and share some of the work that she's doing at the Paradigm Initiative.
Thank you very much, Julian. Happy to be here, and hello, everyone. It's afternoon on my end, so good afternoon. So this afternoon, I'll be speaking about two toolkits, so rather a toolkit and a platform that we as Paradigm Initiative developed. As earlier introduced, I'm Bulanda Nkowani. I work for Paradigm Initiative, which is a Pan-African digital rights organization. We have about 5 offices across Africa, and we are headquartered in Nigeria. So I will be speaking about a toolkit and a digital rights violations reporting platform that we developed. So these two tools are really just part of a wider basket of tools that we've been developing over time, and we choose to call them tools of impact for the digital space. So I'm sure you're all wondering, coming from a digital rights background, what does that have to do with journalists' online safety? I hope you can see my presentation. It's really just graphics. So not much of a presentation. Yeah, so to begin with, so because we work in internet governance and digital rights, we have seen how the internet has disrupted journalism and the media landscape as we know it. We see how a lot of traditional media has evolved into including online platforms and digital tools. We see a lot of physical publications now are online. I don't know how many of us still have access to, like a physical newspaper. Most of us increasingly relying on online publications and online platforms. of course, we see how the internet has enabled media houses to, shift to broadcasting online. We're seeing journalists using digital devices and, of course, the internet to gather information, news, and so on and so forth. So that's why we believe that digital rights is interconnected with the online safety of journalists, which is very important. And maybe just to start off with, we believe that every African has the right to a safe online space. And that's why, we as Paradigm Initiative, together with our partners, have worked to develop some of these tools that would then provide for the safety, online safety of journalists. So to start off, I'll speak about the first tool, which is known as iitam. So this is a digital security toolkit. Essentially, it's a, as I earlier mentioned, digital security toolkit. So it's a proactive toolkit for, So it's a proactive toolkit for African digital rights actors, whistleblowers, journalists who we are focusing on for the sake of this webinar, human rights defenders, and of course, any other ordinary internet user, as long as you have access to the internet. So it's a digital security toolkit that helps one to stay safe and secure as they utilize digital platforms, as well as online platforms. So it was developed by Paradigm Initiative with a host of other partners. And really the toolkit's overarching aim is that it seeks to address the growing need to safeguard digital rights defenders, whistleblowers, journalists, and others that are working on sensitive information in the global south. So I'm sure we'll all agree that increasingly we see journalists being targeted, be it offline and online. We see a lot of surveillance tactics, especially when a journalist is working on a high profile case. We see that there are times when we experience internet shutdowns during crucial times, simply because some governments do not want certain news items, to get out there, because as a journalist during a crucial time, you bring to light some, could be human rights violations that are happening at that particular point, or certain injustices. So increasingly, we have seen internet shutdowns and network blocks. At the same time, this is a toolkit that would enable, for the safety of, physical devices, be it digital devices, but also in the physical aspect. So I will now proceed to just briefly touch on some of the contents of the toolkit. But before I proceed, also just to mention that, so this toolkit remains a living resource, relatively new, but we are committed to releasing newer versions over time. And we will adapt this toolkit annually. I will share links so that everyone is able to access the toolkit and see how helpful it would be for your work. But at the same time, just to mention that we also adapted the toolkit into a game known as Digital Safety in partnership with one of our partners, Policy from Uganda. So we found that because this is a toolkit that's available as a publication, physical publication, it's also available online. Very few people may have that time, the luxury of time to read it and go through it in detail. But what this game does is that it allows you to, play around with the game, assess your digital security knowledge, assess your digital security practices, and at the end of it all, you get recommendations, and you really get to see how digitally secure are you, and what are areas of improvement. So I'd encourage everyone to play that game. Presentations seem to have stored. Okay. So moving along. So these are just some of the components of the toolkit. I will paste the link in the chat for everyone else to have a look. So we start off with a chapter on digital rights, because we believe that everyone in their own right can be a digital rights defender. I mean, if you have access to the internet, naturally you should have, you do have a stake in how the internet evolves, and of course you should be concerned of your digital rights. So there's a component that really just breaks down, what are digital rights? And if you do decide to get into this advocacy, what are some of the avenues that you could utilize? So with that, we have, model policy briefs. If you wanted to put out a coalition statement, where do you begin? What are some of the relevant digital rights events or digital security actors that you could have access to? And more importantly, we have a second chapter, which is really, the practical side of, digital security. So how does one stay safe and secure online? And really all this is very relevant for journalists. As I earlier mentioned, over time, we're seeing a lot of attacks against journalists, both in the physical sense, but more so on the online space. In terms of network disruptions, we see content removals, we see surveillance tactics. So really it's from the simplest of things, such as, how do you put up a strong password? How do you, avoid clicking unknown links? So very basics of digital security to advanced digital security. So for example, how do you enable your two-factor authentication? How do you encrypt your information if you're, let's say, working on a high profile case, or really just information that you don't want lying around? So from the very basic, to advanced digital security. So also in terms of if the internet is shut, or if you're in a space where you really can't access the internet, how do you utilize the VPN to remain anonymous, but at the same time, circumvent that blockage, which then enables you as a journalist, even when the internet is cut, you're able to still carry on with your work and publish. So besides digital security, we also included a component on physical security. So oftentimes, we are concerned with our digital security, how am I interacting online? What are, the pitfalls to look out for? That we forget that, there's the physical aspect of our digital devices. So how are you storing is it your flash drive, your computer, in the physical sense? How are you ensuring that it does not land into the wrong hands? That someone doesn't come and plant some unwanted software on your digital devices, and many other examples. And this toolkit concludes by including a chapter on internet shutdowns. We've seen that these have been very prevalent, and so we found it important to include a component on internet shutdowns. How do you circumvent them? In case of an internet shutdown, how can you contribute to measuring the internet shutdown or the censorship? And how can you get involved overall in the advocacy on internet shutdowns? So in a nutshell, that's it about iitam Digital Security Toolkit. I have pasted some links in the chat section. If you'd like to access it, I encourage everyone to access it. It's a great resource for anyone who has access to the internet and they're looking to really just step up their digital security, and more importantly, for journalists. So moving along, I will now speak about our other toolkit. Okay, so our next toolkit is known as Reportee. It's a digital rights reporting platform. It launched early of this year in April. So really Reportee is a Swahili word which means to report. So in Africa, if you say, Reportee, in most of our dialects, it automatically just signals that the word means to report. So it's a very common word and that appears in most dialects. So we really just wanted a platform that had a unique name, but at the same time that celebrates our African languages. But also, again, a word that is easily understandable and present in most African languages. So why Reportee? I'm sure we're all wondering. So with digital rights violations on the increase, as part of an initiative, of course, together with our partners, we wanted to design a platform that enables stakeholders, the public, internet users, journalists to report digital rights violations that they are faced with. So the platform is accessible to stakeholders within the digital rights circles, but of course, to the wider public as well. So essentially, Reportee is an online platform that enables stakeholders and the public to support a collaborative approach to addressing digital rights violations in Africa. So what does this mean? So stakeholders can use the platform to report violations. And on the back end, as Paradigm Initiative, of course, with other partners, we connect victims to partners and experts who can then provide support for addressing the reported violations. So also just to say that all this information that is reported on this platform is treated with the utmost confidentiality and no identities will be made public. So it's very safe to use Reportee. So really, so when a report is made and received, so how it works, well, essentially is that there's a steering committee which is made up of several partners, and this committee rather is really in charge of overseeing day-to-day operations of this platform and how it will evolve in future. So when a case is reported, the steering committee receives it and then passes it on to the case resolutions committee. So the case resolutions committee really is comprised of advocacy organizations, human rights organizations, lawyers for strategic litigation, researchers, and we've also made provision for national human rights commissions. But at the same time, in case of any escalation, if it's a bigger case, we've also made provision to escalate to the Africa Commission on Human and People's Rights. So once that report is received, it's passed on to the Case Resolutions Committee, who then address it and help the victim to seek justice based on their stakeholder strength. So essentially, Reportee, I would say, so there's a map that's embedded within Reportee. So you as a platform viewer, for example, you're able to see a total number of reports that have been made on the platform, the total number of verified cases, because we have to agree that some reports may sometimes be false alarms. But also it's very good for research purposes because over time, we had been speaking, with all the other stakeholders, speaking of how, digital rights violations or internet shutdowns have been increasing in Africa without really documenting these cases. So what Reportee has enabled now is that, we are able to document all these cases, the different types of cases, which ones are more prevalent, where are they happening? So there's a map that's embedded into this platform and you're able to view, if you want a regional view, a country view. So really, it really just helps paint a better picture of the nature and the state of digital rights violations on the continent. That said, I will paste some of the links for one to access this platform. But also in case you would like to join to be part of either the case resolutions committee or the steering committee. But also just to mention that some of the violations that can be reported, cases, for example, of online gender-based violence, cyberbullying, illegal access to user information, arrests based on online free speech, and this particularly pertains, of course, to journalists. Is it internet censorship that your country is experiencing? So really, most digital rights violations can be reported using this platform. So if as a journalist today, you happen to be arrested for something that you posted online, kindly feel free to use this platform to seek that justice that you need. And ultimately, really, just to say that the platform, besides just being one for reporting, seeking justice, it will, we believe that in the long run, it will help educate more people in terms of what constitutes a digital rights violation. And of course, the importance of documenting and reporting them, because this then enables all other digital rights actors to track and to document everything that has been recorded across the continent. And of course, for everyone to come up with better and evidence-based solutions. So that said, I think, well, that's the end of my presentation. I think my 10 minutes is up. So I'll go ahead and paste these links as well in the chat section And again, I encourage everyone, please have a look at the different platforms. I've also included videos on how you can make a report. So please feel free to play around the platforms, and please do utilize them in your work, because these are very, very crucial platforms that would be very helpful for your work. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Bulanda. You managed to fit a lot in that time, and I really appreciate it. And the Reportee project, I think, is so important, given the rise, as you note, of internet shutdowns in Africa. I wasn't aware of some of the ways to get around that, and I'd love to poke around some of your system or some of your toolkits some more for that. You know, I'm sure many of the people who are watching now know this, but in 2016, the United Nations declared internet access a human right. So it's no less important than some of the other human rights. And someone who really, really knows a great deal about the intersection of human rights, namely free speech, free press, and the United Nations, because he's worked and presented there and done a lot of work, is Palui Tomasi. And I want to pass the floor to him for his brief presentation. And then I would like to remind you, we already got a couple of interesting questions. Feel free to ask your questions. I hope we'll have some time at the end to get to it, but please take it away, Palui.
Thank you very much, Julian. And as Julian have said, I am Palui Tomasi. I'm the director of the IFJ Africa office based in Dakar, Senegal. I am also the head of the secretariat of the Federation of African Journalists, which also works on media freedom and freedom of association. Now, with regards to this presentation, I would directly zero into the experiences and risk faced by journalists, African journalists in particular, with regards to their work online. And for this first slide, can we have the first slide, please? Yeah, I think it is right that we mentioned that despite the numerous positive initiatives that the internet, particularly social media, had brought to the world, it is also true to say that it has introduced new challenges that have a direct impact on the safety and security of journalists. I think the two previous speakers, Bulanda especially, mentioned a lot about this. But then if we look at these developments, I remember some few years ago, we were in Uganda, probably in 2010, when we attended the East African Internet Governance Forum. And at that point in time, the Federation of African Journalists mentioned that some governments in Africa were initiating new laws that governs the internet, which were very severe as compared to what exists in the conventional media. And at that time, maybe what we did not have in mind was that within a short period of time, the harassment online will almost be equal to the harassment that journalists suffer, journalists who work offline suffer. Because now we've seen serious challenges with regards to harassment and intimidation of journalists who work online. Next slide, please. Now, the African Commission on Human and People's Rights in November 2019 adopted what is called the Declaration of Principles on Freedom of Expression and Access to Information in Africa. And it has some beautiful principles or provisions with regards to basic fundamental rights and basic fundamental rights with regards to freedom of expression and freedom of information. Now, one particular interesting point with regards to this presentation is actually principle 22, which says that states shall take measures to prevent attacks on journalists and other media practitioners, including murder, extrajudicial killing, torture, and all forms of ill treatment, arbitrary arrest and detention, enforced disappearances, kidnapping, intimidation, threats, and unlawful surveillance undertaken by state and non-state actors. Now, this is very important because it is giving the state responsibility to protect and defend journalists who work online against some of these measures. But then the irony in this case is that most of the time, it is the state that is involved in unlawful surveillance. Most of the time, it is the state that will actually arrest journalists and force them to open up their emails in order to check. Sometimes they call it subversive materials. Most of the time, states are even involved in the hacking of emails of journalists. So despite the fact that we have some of these very good provisions, the respect for the rule of law with regards to this provision and the safeguarding of the rights of journalists are still undermined by the very states that protect journalists. Yeah, next slide, slide 3. Yeah. Now we cannot give justice to this topic. We cannot talk about the protection of journalists working online without making reference to the UNESCO Global Survey on Online Violence Against Women Journalists, which was released in December 2020. Now that specific survey indicated that online violence has since become the new front line in journalism safety and is characterized by physical threat, sexual violence, online harassment and intimidation, and verbal abuse. Now, interestingly, it goes further to say that online violence against women journalists is designed to belittle them, to humiliate and shame them, to induce fear, to silence and retreat, discredit them professionally, undermining accountability, journalism, and trust in the facts. Now this is very serious because if you make an analysis of the number of attacks on journalists who work online, you now come to realize now that more female journalists suffer from attacks and other forms of violence as compared to their male counterparts. And this is a trend that we must look together, or we must look at together, and then try to see what to do with regards to this growing trend that threatens journalism as a whole. Next slide, please. Now, with regards to the issue of information control, now we have realized that it is now common practice for most governments to make laws with regards to how to tackle disinformation and misinformation, and most especially hate speech and cybercrime. Now most of our governments, especially in Africa, are trying to make laws against with regards to cybercrime and hate speech. But then the truth is that in some instances, these laws are so vague and they only become a pretext to try and stifle dissent or to try and undermine the work of journalists, especially those who are involved in investigative journalism or those who report on corruption and other human rights violations. We have seen a lot of these laws, like the anti-terrorism law in Uganda, which we will discuss a little bit down the lane, and basically they are not in line with good governance and have a difficult puts a serious challenge on the work of journalists, especially those who work online. Next slide, please. Now, we have considered information as a public good, and we have all agreed that this is also critical. It's also a critical pillar of democracy, and that journalists should be allowed to do their work without fear or intimidation, and irrespective of gender or whether they work online. Now, like we have said, we have come to realize that a lot of the violence meted out to journalists who work online falls on our female comrades who work online. Now, with regards to what we can do to stop this, or to put a halt to this, or at least to address this, the International Federation of Journalists, which is the organization that I worked for, on the 25th of November 2019, launched the You Are Not Alone campaign, a campaign that was designed to support women and that face online abuse. Now, this campaign particularly encouraged journalist unions and associations to stand up for their female colleagues. Similarly, there's a need for continental solidarity from men and women of timber and caliber all over the continent to rise up to the occasion and denounce these horrendous and cowardly acts targeted on female journalists. Now, what we have found out, and some of these have also been reflected in the UNESCO Global Report. Now, most of the female journalists who are attacked online, they do not even have places where to report to. Because in some instances, some of the media institutions that they are working for have not taken this threat seriously and did not do anything to address them. Now, but what we are saying at this point in time, because of the nature of the threats, we are saying that this battle on the deliberate attack on the work of female journalists online is not a battle for female journalists alone. Men who work with them, or men who are also involved in journalistic work, and members of civil society, every human rights defender has to stand up and help or work together with our female colleagues to ensure that this issue, these cowardly attacks and harassment are put to a halt once and for all. Now, if we look at the consequences that these attacks have created, now we come to realize that in most instances, these attacks have psychological women, some of whom have to seek for treatment psychologically or emotionally. And it has also led to self-censorship, or worse still, have been able to silence and force some women out of the profession unwillingly. Now, we know of instances where female journalists have been threatened that their photographs or nude photographs, I'm sorry to use that word, but their nude photographs will be published online if they go on with particular stories, and have silenced some journalists or even put them off completely, or force them to abandon the profession. Now, this has contributed in widening the gap in the newsrooms, as well as female representation in both the journalist unions and association, and has serious effects or affects women's contribution in the decision-making process. Because we have found out that a lot of women who actually work online are now retreating or unwilling to take certain jobs or do certain jobs because of fear that they might be harassed, or their families might be harassed if they take up those jobs, or if they make reports with regards to human rights abuses or corruption in relation to their work online. Next slide, please. Like now, I have always said that in my view, if we take a reflection on the genesis of this obnoxious online legislations, now I have always said that countries like Uganda, Ethiopia, Sudan, Nigeria, and Zimbabwe have the most stringent internet laws so far in the continent. And I'm sure that some of you present here will remember the case of Joy Jorin Bira, a Ugandan journalist who was arrested in 2016 and accusing of circulating graphic photos following a raid on the Renzururu King's Palace. I think this is a local chiefdom in Uganda, where actually Bira is from. Now in that particular case, Bira was charged with abetting terrorism for illegally filming a military raid on the King's Palace. That's the local monarch, which is punishable by up to 7 years imprisonment under the Terrorism Act. Now, in fact, the Terrorism Act in Uganda, there are certain provisions with regards to the divulging of information online, which can even constitute a death penalty. A death penalty. I do not remember the specific provisions, but there are very stringent provisions in relation to the divulging of information online, as far as the Terrorism Act is concerned. Now there have also been cases of harassment in Nigeria. Like we said, Nigeria is also one of the countries where you have very stringent laws with regards to the use of the internet. And there was a story with regards to Runa Meya, who was targeted in a campaign of extreme online harassment, which lasted for almost a year, simply because he had made a broadcast with regards to an investigation into what was called the Nigeria syrup scandal, which was actually broadcast by the BBC. And there was an online campaign against Meya, basically because he had revealed certain issues with regards to this syrup cartel. Now, similarly, harassments have also against female journalists also took place in Ghana after the 2020 December general elections, where female journalists like Evan Mensah and Gifty Appiah were also basically harassed with regards to their work as female journalists. Now in conclusion, I brought up 2 points. Next slide, yeah. With regards to the work that we do at the International Federation of Journalists and the Federation of African Journalists. Now, we are saying that first, that with regards to the African media, impunity is one of our greatest impediments. Now, I'm sure these days we are celebrating the International Day to End Impunity against crime for crimes committed against journalists. And we are saying that there's need to strongly address the issue of impunity by ensuring that the perpetrators of these heinous crimes against journalists are arrested and brought to justice. Now, that is the only way that we can end this the issue of impunity and this reckless attacks of journalists online. Sometimes those who attack journalists online are not faceless, because they send you messages and tell you directly who they are and tell you that they will look for you. So they are not invincible all the time. Sometimes they are visible, and we believe that government should do more to protect journalists by ensuring that these perpetrators are arrested and brought to justice. Now, secondly, we also strongly believe that there is need for a drastic reform of the cybersecurity laws as well as the anti-terrorism laws, which undermines media freedom and the work of journalists. Now, some of these laws, we strongly believe directly targets the work of journalists and is an impediment to the freedom of expression and to media freedom. So there needs to be a revision of these laws that will give journalists more flexibility to be able to report on certain violations and certain issues of human rights abuse. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Paul Louis. That was such a fascinating description of the work that you do. I think you really underscored the difference between state intimidation and how much that is a factor in Africa versus private intimidation. I think that there's some comments to that regard in our chat. and the structures that are in place to begin fighting some of that. So if we have any more additional questions, we're running a little bit late, but we're able to take a couple of questions in the chat. Please feel free to send them in the chat or in the Q&A. I suppose I have a brief question to each of the panelists. What do we mean by safety? I mean, I think internet safety can mean the ability to use the internet in a way that is secure and private. We heard a little bit about hacking, but also physical safety. So when you hear safe, let's just a quick, in another 2 or 3 words, what does internet safety mean to each of you? Which do we emphasize more? Mohammed, would you like to? I see you're kind of nodding a little bit.
Tricky question, and thank you for that. Safety online, I think my colleagues in the panel mentioned tackling down physical security and digital security at the same time. I think it was a paradigm initiative with that approach. We also try to do that by we call that holistic approach. And it's not only about digital world, but it takes into consideration the psychological aspect, the physical aspect, and the digital aspect. I would say that that would be the 3 dimensions of safety for journalists.
Thank you so much. Bulanda, do you have you've already kind of talked about it so much, but when it means to be safe, is it an access question or is it something else?
Okay, hard to describe, but really it's I would say just being aware of some of the threats that are available online or when you utilize digital tools. Really, yeah, I'm just anticipating some of these threats. So be it in the physical sense, online, but also being able to relate that to how it would affect you in the long run. So affecting your work, affecting you psychologically. So like I mentioned, very hard to describe, but really more around threats and how those would impact one's life or work in the long run.
Excellent, thank you. And Paulu, I think we have an interesting question for you in the chat, and that is, how do people make sure that laws that are created aren't to protect journalists aren't enforced in such a way to suppress journalists?
Yeah, okay, that's an interesting question. But then let me just first add on to what Blanda had just said with regards to the issue of safety. Now, when we talk of safety, we must realize that safety goes beyond physical attacks. There is a huge psychological dimension to it, which sometimes does more harm than even the physical attacks, especially with regards to what we are experiencing with regards to our female comrades who work online. Now, actually, with regards to the specific question that you've just said on the issue of laws, I think our governments, specifically with regards to Africa, our governments have still failed to demonstrate good political will with regards to some of the laws that have been passed, most especially by the African Commission, with regards to the safety and protection of journalists and other activists. Now, there is no argument that we have very good laws. Now, the problem with the laws that we have is that our governments have failed to implement to the letter some of these provisions that they have already signed and ratified and are even part of our national constitutions. governments have really failed to implement these laws. Now, what do we do? Now, we have been working with the African Union, especially, and trying to see how we can convince governments to actually implement some of these laws. Now, one of the greatest achievements, I think, for the past decade or so was the work that had been done with regards to access to information, where a lot of media organizations across the continent, including API, which was the continental platform, have been able to convince certain governments or created lobby groups in certain countries, and countries have been able to pass legislations with regards to access to information. And we have more countries today that have access to information laws than we had maybe 5-6 years ago. Recently, in my country, the Gambia, and access to information, the president ascended to the bill, and we now have an access to information law. So these are positive developments that the media fraternity in Africa have been able to do, and we hope that governments will be sincere, and then implement some of the laws that are already in place. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul-Louis. That was really excellent, and we want to make sure to kind of keep the conversation going. But the chat is open. Anything that is sent our way, we can certainly forward along to our panelists to answer. But I really would like to thank you for sharing your insights. Thank all of you. As an American living far from home in a country that has its cybersecurity challenges in Ukraine, where I am right now, the insights that you've shared are, I think, really important, and I think that there's a lot of lessons to be learned from your experience as well. You're all the power to you, and I think we can all agree that it's important to keep in touch and stay on top of developing challenges and their solutions. With that, brief applause to our panelists, and I'll pass it back to Kaylee from the Global Cyber Alliance. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, everyone. We'll make a quick break, and then we'll come back for the second panel, and we'll be touching a lot more on this issue of laws with the next panelists. I'll see you in a couple of minutes. It's time for coffee. and we're back live. Hello again, everyone, and thank you for staying with us. I will directly give the floor to Mr. Emmanuel Gedatsu, who's Vice President of the E-Governance and Internet Governance Foundation for Africa, one of GCA's trusted partner. The floor is yours, Emmanuel.
Yeah, thank you very much, and greetings to all our audience across the world watching us live. I think the first part has been a very wonderful presentation from all the panelists, and I must say I have really learned a lot, and it has been an eye-opener to me, and we are very grateful to the panelists. All right, in this second section, we are actually going to be looking at the efforts being made or put in place to protect journalists in Africa, and what the various governments across Africa are doing to protect media freedom. All right, to help me do this, I have three strong and well-researched fellows who are going to help us to really understand what the government across Africa are doing to protect the freedom of journalists. All right, so with me today on this virtual platform, I want a very young and dynamic female by the name Felicia Antonio. She works with Access Now. Access Now is an internet-based freedom organization that promotes the freedom of access to every individual. Well, Felicia has been a very astute campaigner to ensure that every individual on this earth has freedom or access to the resources on the internet. She has a master's degree and also has a Bachelor of Arts degree in French and Psychology from the University of Ghana, and she has been very, very instrumental in her field. Well, she's going to also give us a little bit of what the experiences she has gathered all throughout this period of her life and industry. All right, then the second personality is Tony Raymond Karibira. Tony is a law researcher, actually a PhD in law researcher at the University of Portsmouth. And he also teaches some courses at the University of Greenwich and University of Portsmouth as well. He has also been very instrumental in the field of internet access and freedom of individuals or journalists on the internet and access to tools. All right, he has worked a lot on national criminal courts and so many others. So I'm sure Tony is going to really share his experiences with us very soon. Then also is Mr. Albert Anchibosiakon. Actually, he is the founder of E-Crime Bureau. And E-Crime Bureau in Ghana and across the West African sub-region is one of the institutions that are well-versed in cybersecurity technologies. Mr. Albert also coupled as now the head of the cybersecurity agency that has been constituted recently in Ghana. He has so much experiences and he is a very practical man on the field. So today, these three astute individuals are going to help us understand and see how journalists in Africa can be protected and what the government is also doing to protect them. So ladies and gentlemen across the world, you are welcome to this virtual platform. May I now have the honor to invite on board, to start with, it's a ladies first. So I'm going to give the opportunity to Felicia Antonio to really start with us. So Felicia, well, just give us a brief of what you have for us today.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction, and it's really a pleasure to be here. As you rightly said, I will be speaking about issues on my current role and my past experience as an advocate for safety of journalists issues in Africa. So I am a campaigner for Access Now's Keep It On campaign. And Keep It On is a global campaign that unites over 250 organizations around the world. And our main objective is to fight internet shutdowns as they happen worldwide. And so from 2016, when the Keep It On campaign was launched, we have seen that internet shutdowns are becoming a threat to the enjoyment of fundamental human rights, including freedom of expression, access to information, and freedom of assembly rights. And since then, we have documented over 760 shutdowns across the globe. And the reason why this is important for today's topic or discussion is that our monitoring shows that internet shutdowns affect and directly interfere with the work of journalists and human rights defenders. And most shutdowns that happen in Africa happen around elections and protests, usually on a national scale. So if you're following the news, we currently have an internet shutdown happening in Sudan. And this means that journalists would have difficulty in accessing information, responding swiftly to what is happening in the country. And that is what internet shutdowns do when they deny people access to information. Secondly, we have seen that there is a correlation between internet shutdowns and human rights abuses. And if we all look back in 2019, when the internet was shut down in Sudan, several human rights abuses were perpetrated against citizens, including killings and sexual violence. And that is why it's concerning that whenever the internet is shut down, we all have to speak up against it and denounce it to have access back, to enable journalists who are able to unravel such heinous crimes against citizens be able to do their work without any interference. As I also mentioned, internet shutdowns happen around elections, and there is, we've noticed that there is usually a lot of protests when the internet is shut down and the election results are announced. And this is to say that internet shutdowns do mar the credibility of election outcome. That being said, I think the previous panelists have already mentioned the various initiatives being undertaken to ensure that journalists are able to do their work, both in the online and offline space. And so just to re-echo that, next week we will be celebrating the International Day to End Impunity for Crimes Against Journalists. And it would have been a perfect day to celebrate and kind of see all the perpetrators that are preventing journalists from doing their work, targeting journalists from doing their work. And sadly, there are even journalists that have been killed in line of duty for doing their work. Yet the response to arrest and prosecute these perpetrators is really slow. And that is an area that almost all the speakers have mentioned and highlighted, that impunity for crimes against journalists has to be tackled swiftly. And this is something that I'm also going to re-echo in my submission. We all remember that in 2012, the United Nations Human Rights Council approved a resolution stating that the right to freedom of expression on the internet should be protected by states. And this means that the same rights that people have offline must be protected online, according to this resolution. And so there is a connection between our offline and online rights. And so these rights have to be protected by all actors. And so I have a number of recommendations for states around the globe. And one thing that I think would be a deterrent to people that attack journalists is for state actors to actively and publicly denounce and condemn attacks against journalists. when they happen. And so we urge governments to speak up when journalists are being attacked and to condemn the perpetrators and hold them to account whenever these attacks happen. We also need to ensure that journalists are free to do their work independently without interference, both online and offline, from any quarters. And I cannot emphasize enough the need for governments and state actors to avoid imposing repressive measures such as internet shutdowns and censorships, which directly interfere with journalists' ability to monitor and document happenings transparently and independently. And then also, we've seen governments adopting laws, including with reasons like fighting cybercrime or terrorism and other online threats. But then we still insist that these laws must be human rights centric and should prohibit journalists being attacked or other stakeholders leveraging these laws that are adopted to prevent journalists from doing their work. And so such laws should be human rights respecting so that it doesn't interfere with the work that journalists do. And then also the last recommendation I would have for journalists is that there's a need for governments to dedicate resources to ensure that crimes against journalists are investigated to a complete end and the perpetrators are brought to book. And in doing this, it is also important to develop and implement gender-sensitive strategies for combating impunity for attacks and violence against journalists. And we've seen how female journalists are kind of faced with challenges as journalists and then again as women. And so we need to adopt the right policies to ensure that journalists, particularly female journalists, are able to carry out their duties safely without any fear from any quarters. And then I think another, even though this wasn't the purpose, but then I think civil society and other stakeholders have an important role to play to ensure that journalist safety issues continue to be discussed and to provide the capacity building and capacity needs that journalists need to be able to do their work both online and offline. And so it's important to equip state officials, particularly security agencies, because in most of the countries, the perpetrators of these shutdowns are usually security agencies or security agents. And so it's important to provide training and awareness raising on their responsibility to protect journalists and work with them cordially. They are not their enemies, and so they should rather protect them on the field rather than competing with them and trying to prevent them from doing their work. And I think there was this initiative by the Media Foundation for West Africa, where I was formerly, and they developed a framework on police media relations and safety of journalists in Africa. And I think this initiative should be replicated across the continent so that we can improve the relations that we have with the media and the police in this space. And then initiatives like the helpline desk that my colleague Mohammed mentioned is also available for journalists to access and request for the necessary digital security support that they need to be able to do their work. And then also, I think last year, UNESCO, together with other partners, launched an online course, which is a massive open online course on how to report safely, a guide for women, journalists, and their allies. And I think this is a very important resource that journalists can access to be able to do their work diligently. And that is the recommendations I have. And I would hand over to the moderator or the next speaker now. Thank you.
Wow, that has been a very great presentation. Well, very wonderful session with you, Felicia. We are most grateful. All right, I think we will delve in straight to Raymond. I can see Raymond is very poised to also contribute his expertise and knowledge that he has gathered so far with all of us. And after which, after the 3 presentations, then the question will begin to come in and will resolve. So Raymond, you have the virtual floor.
Good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Glad to be part of this amazing platform with the esteemed speakers and all our key stakeholders, including journalists. It's a pleasure to share always views about our safety, but more so online. And in terms of policy, still, what I would just like to do in these minutes is to just briefly highlight what is available in terms of policies and laws on the African continent that we could consider as good tools for implementing in our different countries across Africa. And I've been impressed with the previous speakers, especially being able to clarify on the challenges that are still evolving with this digital era for journalists. For example, Thomasy noted use of laws, arbitrary use of laws to curtail freedom of expression online. So what have we seen? We see that, of course, there's a proliferation of cybercrime legislations across the continent. But what that actually means in practice is states, they've mentioned Nigeria, they've mentioned Egypt, for example, the Cybercrime Act of Nigeria 2015, that states are using these laws to actually limit freedom of expression online. But nonetheless, we still expect states to take action, and there's been some developments in quite a number of countries in Africa that I would not be able to mention all the cases. But for example, we see that in Kenya, recently, the High Court in Kenya, in a case of Andare versus the Attorney General, stated that in implementing the laws on cybercrime, the states have to ensure that the laws comply with freedom of expression. So that case involved somebody that made a Facebook post about a politician, and the person was charged under the Information and Communication Act of Kenya, something as vague as grossly offensive statements. So broadly, the African Charter on Human and People's Rights that was adopted in 1981 is a legally binding instrument in Africa, and it is usually interpreted by the African Court of Human Rights, has also affirmed the importance of freedom of expression in the case of Koneti versus Burkina Faso 2013, and that case involved libel, that the court held that criminal defamation does not have any place in modern democracy. But also, we look at the African Charter on Democracy, Elections, and Governance of 2007. This one is actually a legally binding instrument that also touches on these aspects. For example, compliance, that states are required to submit every 2 years reports to the African Commission to show the measures that they take in terms of implementing the provisions. But the problem again is with the compliance. For example, in the East African region, only Tanzania has signed this Charter. But then also we have what we call soft law, the Declaration of Principles on Freedom of Expression in Africa. This is a soft law instrument. What does it mean? That it is supposed to guide states. It is not legally binding, but guide states. And there are two things here to note, that there's what they call negative and positive duties. So the negative means that the states have to refrain from interfering in journalists' rights, including freedom of expression online. But also the positive duties mean that there should be actually affirmative action to protect journalists' freedom of expression online and their cyber security. And then in 2016, the African Commission adopted a resolution on the right to freedom of information and expression on the internet in Africa. This also includes the aspect of privacy online, quite important for the realization of freedom of expression. And this is an important guide. But in 2014, the African Union adopted the African Union Convention on Cybersecurity and Personal Data Protection in Malabo, which we call the Malabo Convention. This is a comprehensive instrument that sets clear guidelines for cybersecurity in Africa. And in 2018, again, the African Union adopted guidelines, protections on guidelines on protection of data security. Of course, with the GDPR in Europe, there's been, regional efforts to really protect data. But what is important in this Malabo Convention is there's a balance, but also rights for the stakeholders. Who are these stakeholders? One, the governments. The governments have to ensure that data protection laws also are in place, but also do not interfere with journalists' rights. The other key stakeholder are the companies. For example, think of internet service providers. Think of Google, for example. They too are key stakeholders in data protection. And then the citizens or the users, in this case, the journalists, they have to be active stakeholders in all issues to do with data privacy, but also the laws. But the problem with this convention is that it has limited adoption. At the moment, only 10 countries have ratified, and the convention needs at least 16 countries to ratify. That means it's not really working at the moment. So what do we do, to really push, to continue efforts to push the governments in African states to ratify? I think the latest in July, Togo ratified this convention. So we have to keep pushing the governments to ratify this very important convention on data protection. But Article 25 explicitly says that the state should not interfere with the fundamental rights of the people, And at the moment, at least 14 African countries have data protection laws, but they are required actually to have these laws in place, And not just having the laws, the states should also implement these instruments by making sure they have data protection authorities. But this is also a challenge. For example, in South Africa and Morocco, they have good data protection authorities, but they have challenges of funding. What did we see? At least when we have data protection laws coming in place, these are really good for protecting online privacy. There was an interesting case again from Kenya recently, Nubian Rights Forum and another versus the Attorney General. it involved implementation of the National Integrated Identity Management System. The Kenyan government wanted to integrate data for the national identification process. And they were challenged because at the time, there was not really data protection law in place. And the courts, the High Court said, no, hang on until there's a proper data protection framework. So what does this mean? Is that we have to continue our efforts and making sure that the governments, the states take up their duty to fulfill their obligations at the domestic level. You know, in the EU, for example, there's the GDPR, and then also there's the California Consumer Privacy Act, also a new law in California, where most of these big tech companies are based. So again, in terms of cybersecurity, it's quite important that we get states to implement their duties. Otherwise, we're going to keep having these very, very good laws, but not being implemented. Thank you so much. I look forward to any comments, suggestions, or remarks.
Wow. You have just whet my appetites into the various laws across the world. Well, I'm sure our audiences have quite a number of questions that may be coming up. Thank you so much, Raymond. It has been a wonderful and very educative presentation, bringing or refreshing us with the various laws that exist. We talk of the Malabo Convention and its related impact it has had on countries across Africa enacting their own privacy laws. Thank you so much for that presentation. And I'm sure in due time, the questions will be coming and then you would do justice to them. All right, without wasting much time, I would go online to get in touch with Mr. Entry Bosiakon. So Mr. Entry, the virtual floor is yours.
All right, thank you very much. I hope I'm very clear.
Yes.
Okay, I think I need to issue an initial disclaimer. I'm not Dr. Albert Enchiboisiakon. I don't have a PhD yet. My name is Owusu. I'm with the operations of the Cybersecurity Authority. And then he's also not a Mr. He's Dr. Albert Enchiboisiakon. And then the last correction I need to make is the Cybersecurity Authority, and it's not an agency. So I just needed to issue these disclaimers before I move on to the substantive issues at hand. It's very instructive that the Malabo Convention has come up strongly in this discussion, and Ghana is one of the few countries to have signed and ratified the Malabo Convention as we have it. Ghana is also very committed to ensuring that the digital rights of all citizens and the freedom of expression of journalists and the media, especially within the provisions of the Malabo Convention and other international and national laws, are protected without any impediment whatsoever. I think we're also well aware that Ghana is a very stable and democratic country and has over the years earned a reputation as being one of the most media-friendly countries in the world, not only in Africa. In terms of the World Press Freedom Index, there has been consistent improvement from 67th in 2002 to 23rd as at 2008, and then from 19th place among African countries to the first place. Rights such as data protection and privacy are incorporated in legislation in addition to other freedoms enjoyed by Ghanaian citizens. According to a 2018 report on the state of internet freedom in Africa by the Collaboration on International ICT Policy in East and Southern Africa, Ghana indeed received a favorable rating. Now, I'll quickly like to move into some challenges that have been experienced over the years. The right to freedom of expression is definitely guaranteed under the Constitution and is widely honored in practice, both online and definitely in print. In 2001, the criminal defamation and sedition laws were repealed, allowing people to express themselves more freely. And then in March 2020 as well, Parliament passed the Right to Information Act, which was assented to by the president in May 2020. However, the country is also faced with the issue of disinformation, defamation, and sensationalism online due to the allowance of this freedom of expression provided by the Constitution. And then indeed, these are issues that the Cybersecurity Authority and other relevant institutions and stakeholders have been trying to address over the years. As we have it today, there's no specific laws to combat disinformation especially. However, the Criminal and Other Offences Act and Electronic Communications Act both contain sections that can be used to prosecute some of these offenses. The publication or reproduction of any statement, rumor, or report which is likely to cause fear and alarm to the public or to disturb the public peace, knowing and having reason to believe that the statement, rumor, or report is false, according to Section 208 of the Criminal and Other Offences Act, is actually in place. And if you've been following some of the stories going around in Ghana, we have one or two very prominent people who are currently in the courts for this. Similarly, the Electronic Communications Act forbids using electronic communication to knowingly send a communication that is false and deceptive and likely to damage the efficiency of life-saving service or to threaten the safety of any persons, ship, aircraft, and the rest. In May of this year, we have some persons who were arrested and charged under sections of the Electronic Communications Act for disseminating a video on YouTube encouraging Ghanaians to kill police officers and burn some houses, and claiming that the government partial lockdown were as a result or was actually a plan to lay 5G cables, which was also prevalent in other parts of the world. Again, in 2020, the government of Ghana and the Federal Republic of Germany jointly signed and launched the Digital Inclusion Statement. It was on February 6th during the 8th Annual Freedom Online Conference organized here in Accra. I think Ghana was the chairperson of the FOC at that point. The Digital Inclusion Statement is basically aimed at bridging the digital divide by identifying the persistent lack of digital inclusion, especially in developing countries, that prevents especially citizenry from realizing the full potential and benefits of the internet, whilst at the same time promoting the expression of internet freedom. So indeed, Ghana today recognizes the need to allow a citizenry to enjoy media freedom, having access to the internet and the rest of it. So it's very imperative that the safeguards that should be in place to allow for the full enjoyment of these services are enshrined. Ghana is still and currently part of the co-chair of the FOC Task Force on Digital Inclusion, which aims to look at ways to implement the call of actions as specified in the Digital Inclusion Statement. Indeed, there have been a number of engagements with the Ghana Journalists Association on cybercrime and cybersecurity related issues, and especially trying very hard for journalists to understand the provisions in the Cybersecurity Act as part of the National Cybersecurity Awareness Program as we have it. The first speaker, I think in the first panel discussion, Louis mentioned the fact that a lot of female journalists have been experiencing sextortion and the threats to distribute intimate images and the rest of them. I think for the purposes of this engagement, I would like to state that under Section 68 of the current Cybersecurity Act 2020, that is Act 1038, is actually a threat. It's an offense to even threaten to distribute intimate images of a person. So it's not even the question of whether you've distributed or not. That whole concept of threatening, making that phone call, sending that text message that I have this image of you, and if indeed you don't do this or you don't stop doing this, I'm gonna distribute these images is an offense under the Act. And I think it's one of the points we should be taken away from this engagement. Indeed, there's a need for a policy framework in the country that will safeguard the rights of journalists and the media, and all these will need to be done within the confines of the Constitution and other relevant laws as we have them. So these will be my initial submissions for this engagement. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very, very much. It appears that we have very fantastic and great laws to protect us on the cyber level and also give some ways for journalists to be protected. Well, my first question for now goes to Raymond. Raymond, I think we have the freedom of information and privacy are two key things that all of us would want to enjoy. Would want to be in the news, want to hear the right news or the right info from journalists. However, individuals whom this reportage is also about also have their privacies to be protected. And I think this has been the foundation for example, the Malabo Convention and also Convention 108 that led to the GDPR. So my question is, how should journalists blend the two, the privacy of the individual or people's privacy and also bringing the news to the public? How should journalists manage these two? Because the two are very important. The privacy of the individual and the information that also needs to get out there, they are very, very key. So how should journalists approach these two issues in order to make sure that even though you are reporting about an individual, their privacy is also respected?
Thank you for that good question, Emmanuel. It reminds me of the times I used to go to the court to defend a newspaper because of just somebody's picture getting in the newspaper and without their consent. But what we have to know again in terms of privacy is that, like you said, each individual has a right to their privacy. So online, again, what we want to make sure to do is first to read the regulations and the terms or the conditions that regulate the media that we use. I could give an example. We have Facebook, we have Twitter. We have to be careful because there are laws that regulate the content on there, including privacy, but sometimes we take this for granted. Maybe sometimes we're not aware as journalists. You know, for example, when you read a lot of these terms, all these rules, they'll always say that the rights of privacy, the person who owns the picture retains the right to their privacy, you know? So that obviously rings a bell that if the journalist went ahead to disclose some of their information without their consent, they will be liable, not the platform, you know? So we have to be careful about reading the terms of the platforms that we use, especially social media. I always tell journalists, the fact that I post a picture on Facebook, it does not mean you have a right to use it, you know? It does not mean you have a right to use it. However, you can approach me and I say, okay, you can use the picture, you know? So we have to be extremely careful to seek consent. There's a difference between news and there's a difference between advertising. That's the other thing, you know? There's a difference between news and advertising. So that is another danger, actually, that you're not sometimes only infringing upon the person's right to privacy, but you are also infringing upon copyright. So there's also copyright, and now that one involves a lot of money, you know? So it all depends, but like I said, we have to understand the conditions under which we work.
Well, thank you so much. Well, there's a question on the platform, and I would want to also add a little bit to it to give us a better perspective. So to you, Felicia, well, Carl is asking the following, okay, so I would like us, what are the actions you are taking to improve relations between government, legislature, and the media? We all know that the media, the government is very important. The legislators are also very key. And the media is also very key in the governance of any nation. However, from your statistics and analysis, we had what, 760 shutdowns, and this always happens around what, election time, and it's most of the time nationwide. So how would you, or what are you trying to do to ensure that these three key areas come together? The government, legislators, and then the media come together. We know this is the problem. How do we go about it so that society or the citizens can be the beneficiary of the improvements and the benefits that we can all have? So to you, Felicia.
Okay, thank you very much for that question. And all right, under the Keep It On campaign, I say that it's a very holistic campaign. And so we have an elections campaign where we engage with the various stakeholders, including governments, telcos, when it comes to issues of internet shutdown. So I'm using this example. Prior to elections, beginning of year, we identify elections that are high risk. That is to say, the likelihood of a shutdown happening in those countries around that election. And this is identified due to various reasons. First of all, has that country shut down the internet in the past or not? And what is the current, or what would the future look like, even though it's difficult to predict the future? But then are there any indicators that the government would want to restrict online freedoms around elections? So once we identify this, we go ahead to engage the government through an open letter that was adopted by the coalition in 2016. And so we use this format. We first of all highlight the importance of keeping the internet on during elections, how citizens can actually leverage internet access, social media platforms to engage in electoral processes, and then also the various frameworks, regional and international frameworks that provide for governments to ensure that citizens have access to the internet at all times, and also how internet shutdowns would actually mark credibility of results, encourage perpetration of human rights abuses against people. And we send this open letter, make a number of recommendations to the government officials, to the telco regulators, as well as the internet service providers operating in these countries. So this is for them to know that there is this coalition watching and doing this work in the first place. And then once this is sent, we publicize it as much as possible, like everywhere that we can, to make sure that the governments know that we have made it public. And so they have to keep that in mind, whatever decision they take in the end. That being said, you have governments that you do all these engagements, yet they go ahead and they shut down the internet. There are others that have not shut down the internet, and I would use Ghana as an example because we haven't shut down the internet and it continues to be an example. Another example is Benin. In the last election in April, the government did not shut down the internet, but then in 2019, there was an internet shutdown during the country's legislative elections. And so we believe that these engagements are important for us to interact with these stakeholders and let them know that these are the bad reasons why you shouldn't shut down the internet, and it cannot be justified in any way at all. And so why go ahead and do it? Internet shutdowns would, first of all, mar your reputation as a free country, because once you shut it down, you have violated the fundamental rights of people. So that is how we engage with the stakeholders. And then we don't forget the users or the people that are supposed to actually benefit from this whole campaign. And so if we realize that there's going to be an internet shutdown, mostly if it's a partial shutdown, that is, if let's say social media platforms are blocked or certain platforms are targeted, then we provide resources like virtual private networks, which have been audited by our digital security helpline. And I must say that there are a lot of VPNs on the market, but then you have to use secure ones. And so make sure you seek the support of a digital security expert to be able to decide on which VPN you are using. And then also we rely on people to monitor internet traffic whenever the internet is disrupted. This provides us with evidence of these shutdowns. And then when we take government reports, then we can show these evidence as well as stories that we've collated from people discussing how internet shutdowns have impacted them and how it prevented them from accessing certain opportunities or information online. And then we make this important. And this particular campaign is very important because it shows how people are impacted by internet shutdowns. And that is what we want governments to understand, that internet shutdowns affect people this way, that way, they violate fundamental human rights. And so they should stop shutting it down. So that is how we engage with the various stakeholders when it comes to internet shutdown related issues. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. I think we are running out of time, but my last question to you both. Okay, we have seen at any time regime of any government, there's most likely to be a pro-media house for that particular government. And journalists in turn also use this to propagate, so many things against the citizens because they are, let me put it in quote, aligned with the ruling government, and it's cut across the world. What would be your advice to such journalists? Because I think the purpose of journalism is to help the citizens. And if one journalist or one media house uses their platform to actually help the government in, let me put it in quotes, a very negative way against the citizens, then that is not being fair to us, because we are also speaking for those that the government is acting against. So what do we have to say in relation to those journalists or media houses across the world who are also fostering or trying to help the current government or the government in question to actually push forth their agenda? What would you have to say to such journalists as well?
Okay, I will go first. I think that it comes to the issue of ownership, and that is an ongoing conversation. Some media houses are owned by certain people, and they have direct influence in the operations of the media house. There are others that are owned by the same group of people, but they are very independent and recognized across the globe or across the continent as being one of the lead independent media outlets that you can get. So I think that every situation differs, but what I would say is that journalism is about informing the public and providing them with information and improving the public good. And so you promoting one side of the story doesn't do that. And so it's important for them to continuously be trained, continuously be open-minded in the work that they do, and recognize or even learn from best practices of other colleagues in other media houses across the continent as to how they are doing the work, and then they can apply that. But it actually depends on who owns that particular media house and how much influence they have in the activities of the particular the people that work in these media houses, and how much can let's say the staff resist if there's too much interference in the work that they do. But I am for independent journalism, and I think that that is what we are all here for, and we shouldn't encourage partisan journalism in any way. That is what I will have to say.
All right, thank you very much. So Tony, in 1 minute, let's hear from you.
Such journalists have to know, the ones that take partisan positions, especially with brutal governments, that you cannot divorce freedom of expression from the principle of democracy. So in whatever we do, in all the reporting that you do actually, you are not only seeking to express your views, but you're also seeking to actually fight for democracy and promote democracy. So in my opinion, if a journalist is aligned to any regime that is repressive, they would actually be exercising the right to freedom of speech by actually curtailing democracy.
Final question, asking if there are laws against journalists taking images of people without their seeking their permission first. If there are any laws.
I think that we already said the data protection laws for each country have to show, for example, the limits of such actions. But as a matter of fact, in most countries, it would be an infringement of one's right to take their picture without their consent if they're not in a public place. The only exception would be if they're committing a crime. But otherwise, they would sue the journalist for breach of privacy under their laws, yeah.
Under their laws. Thank you very much. So I think that surely falls under the purview of data protection and privacy laws of each and every country. And you have to be very careful because privacy, people's privacy is gaining traction across the world, and Africa is not left out. Most African countries now have data protection laws in place. So which every journalist should be guided by these laws and act lawfully so that in your reportage, trying to inform the public, you don't infringe on the right of other personalities. Well, I think we would have wished for more time to discuss further because the learnings and the experiences shared are very, very exciting. However, our time will not permit us to go further. So thank you, our panelists. We are very grateful. So over to you, Kylie.
Yes, thank you, Emmanuel, and thank you to all the panelists. It was very, very insightful. I will actually give the floor directly to Ms. Brensil Kaimba, a cybersecurity consultant at Serianu, for the conclusion. Brensil, are you here?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Kylie, for that. Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So yeah, just thank you for the opportunity to give the conclusion. My name is Brensil Kaimba from Serianu. And I think from the session that we've had, we cannot deny the essential role of journalists in Africa. And I will specifically point to even what they have done for Kenya when we were having our post-election violence. They brought a lot of things to light. When we were having the COVID pandemic, it's the journalists that brought a lot of information to us that has actually saved a lot of lives. And one of the key learning points that I have picked from this session is one of the UN 2016 Declaration of Internet as a Human Right. That is something that a majority of people don't really understand. This is one of the messages that I think Global Cyber Alliance is trying to push through this initiative. And Mr. Tomasi mentioned something in line with this. Internet has brought very good benefits to Africa, but it has not been so great for journalists. And some of the things that we've actually talked about include online gender-based violence. We've talked about arrests based on your online speech, internet censorship, cyberbullying, just to mention a few. And the goal for the different stakeholders that are involved in this particular project is is to highlight some of these issues and also to present us with solutions that would help improve the situation. Issues such as secure communications and the different options that exist, particularly for journalists, and how to report for human rights violation activists. How can they find a safe way of reporting the injustices that are being done to them? So I would just like to particularly point out from the first session, protecting the online safety of journalists, a global challenge. I would like to appreciate that it has actually been a continent-wide perspective, even from the panelists that have joined us, Mr. Mohammed, Ms. Nkolani, and Mr. Palui Thomani. When we were having the first session and we were talking about access, sorry, let me confirm if I'm online. Okay, yes, and we were talking about access now, and the journalists that are struggling with intimidation. I was glad to hear that they have a helpline or a help desk that specifically deals with that. And when Ms. Nkolani was talking about a platform for whistleblowers and the Reportee platform, again, these are some of the solutions that need to be put out there, because sometimes it's the information that is lacking in terms of our journalists. Just to quote Mr. Palui Thomasi, I think your session was very informative and you're a very informative speaker. You talked about this specific statement. Social media has introduced new challenges, particularly to the safety of journalists. Online violence has since become the new front line in journalism safety, and is characterized by physical, sexual, and online harassment. So I think having solutions to such issues, I think would really help to improve the posture for our journalists, because like we've mentioned, they play a critical role in informing us what's happening as a continent, basically. And from the second session, which was Africa Media Policy in the Digital Age, with Mr. Emmanuel, Ms. Felicia, and Mr. Tony, and Mr. Albert, I think, like you've mentioned in this session where we're looking at a lot of policies, freedom of information and privacy is essential. And yes, as Africa, we are deploying a lot of laws and regulations, especially around cybercrime and around data protection. And just as, like, for example, in Kenya, when we're implementing such laws, a lot of issues came up about how these laws are being twisted to either track, monitor, or infringe on the rights of journalists. These are the discussions that we need to have and see how we are going to merge and align with both regulators, policymakers, to ensure that the rights of our journalists are put at the forefront. So it's clear that there needs to be a drastic reform in the laws that undermine media freedom or freedom of journalists. And I think from my perspective is that this is a journey, and we believe that these interactions that we are having, like this webinar that we are having, are important to help mitigate some of these problems that we are facing. And just to point out, I think last month, through a partnership with Amnesty International and Global Cyber Alliance, I was able to go and discuss with 50 journalists here in Kenya. And they were pointing out the same issues, such as how do they access online safety? How do they access information online in a secure manner? What do they do if they're being tracked or targeted by government? And these are some of the discussion, and it's a journey. And by sharing this information, I think it helps to find solutions that are there. I would like to also point out that these are not a one-time session. So we like, for instance, here in Kenya, we are planning more sessions with the journalists. Next year is an election year. So we need to have more sessions to sensitize journalists on how, should things go wrong, what do they need to do? And I'm happy that the speaker in the just concluded session have talked about some of the initiatives and the discussions that they have done with governments before internet shutdown. So these are some of the initiatives that we can borrow even in Kenya as we're going to an election year, to minimize some of the effects of election violence or violence against journalists. So in conclusion, I would just like to thank Global Cyber Alliance for organizing this very informative session. I would like to thank the key partners that have participated in this, including e-governance and internet governance for Africa. Strathmore University iLab, I would like to thank you for making this possible. The Liberia Cybercrime Prevention and Mitigation Authority, thank you so much. Reale Cybersecurity, and of course my organization, Seriano Limited. And I think this initiative is very timely. It's very important. And I do hope that we have more of these regional sessions for us to share information, but also to come up with solutions where none exists. Yeah, so thank you so much. I believe that should be my conclusion for this.
Thank you, Brensil, and indeed, thank you to all the speakers, the moderators, and all the attendees for today. And stay tuned for more sessions to protect the rights of journalists, either from GCA or all our great partners here today. Thank you all, and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.